We're live. Professor Morris Fiorina. Did I pronounce that right?
Correct.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the show, and I'm so happy to have you here. How are you
Well,
today?
I'm happy to be here.
I reached out to you because I had a wonderful conversation with a professor named Jim Thurber, and we talked about political polarization, lobbying, and I put his episode into AI. We were just talking about AI off cam, but I put his episode into AI and I said, make some recommendations of folk who, do this type of rigorous and thoughtful work. And your name came up. And so when I reached out, you kindly sent me your book, Unstable Majorities Continue. And I'm here I would love to talk a little bit more about our unstable majorities and the way that our political system has been progressing. And I want to do this from an objective way, nonpartisan, just to examine the development of the system over time rather than perhaps commenting on particular ideologies.
Fine.
So I want to begin with, I think most people, at least my age and I guess younger, so 30 and younger, I think the whole world of politics turned into a show of entertainment around 2016. And people started flipping into politics and really applying it to almost every aspect of their everyday lives.
Yes.
Right around the time that Trump swung into the scene. And before that, politics were had a much different place in society. And so maybe you could begin by telling me, leading up to this world that Trump and his personality have disrupted in that kind of way they did, a little bit of what the way the political systems in the country would work.
Well, I'm dated differently. This has been a gradual process. Basically, politics is always changing, and it's been changing through I've been a professor for 54 years now, and it's been changing through that time. And some of the things we're talking about began in the 60s, some of them more in the 80s. And I'd actually challenge the notion that politics has become a bigger part of everybody's life. That it is true that there is a subset of the population. One of my colleagues, a young woman, and her husband, Yana Kropnikoff and John Barry Ryan, have a really good book on this called The Truly Involved, I think. And the argument, and other data support this as well, is there is about 15% of the population who live and breathe politics.
15.
15, exactly.
Gotcha.
And this group is about equally divided between conservatives and liberals. It's not overwhelmingly, but disproportionately white, educated, affluent, more female on the Democratic side, more male on the Republican side. And they're just different from the rest of us. That the other 85%, really, the analogy I use for students is, would like government to be like the utility company. Walk into a room, it's dark, you flip the switch and the lights go on. It's too hot, you turn the thermostat down. And when things don't work, when the power's out, people get pissed, and they sort of decide, I need to change something here. And if you look at the data, and I have a table in the book that I always upgrade this table every year for talks about how much people pay attention to politics, actually to media for that matter. Cite a few figures here, I keep it in mind.
Yes, please.
About 65% of the people went out there and voted last time. The
Okay.
number who watched the Harris-Trump debate was about a quarter of the eligible electorate. It used to be higher. It used to be the case that basically people would, like students, you suddenly realize the midterm is almost here, and so, God, I got to learn something. And so the election is coming up. I have to learn something about these people. So they watch. But that isn't even the case anymore. Now, watch the NBC or CBS or ABC nightly news, 7%. Subscribe to the New York Times, a little under 5%. Watch Fox News Prime Time, 1.2%. Watch Anderson Cooper 360, 0.3%. Watch MSNBC Primetime, 0.5%. That the proportion, the number of people paying attention to these shows, and they consider themselves big hits if they have 900,000, and you look at the audience, we're talking about some fraction of 1% of the population. And yet the problem is these are the public face of politics. These are the people you see on TV. These are the people who post. Twitter used to be just a cesspool like this, that only 20% of the population had Twitter accounts. Not all were responding for political. They have other reasons to be on Twitter. A big Pew study that tracked tweets for a 3-month period found that 97% of the tweets and retweets were accounted for by I believe it's 3% of the population.
No way.
3% of the population. So it's this huge sort of series of different echo chambers, but they're talking to each other. But the notion that a big chunk of America is engaged in an echo chamber, that's just fallacious. That most Americans really aren't interested in politics. A fair number of them would like to avoid politics as much as they can. They just want things to work.
Mhm.
And so we have a political system, and this is my general sort of gestalt, is simply disconnected from the electorate at large. That there's a political class that's numbering certainly less than 1 out of 5 people, and they dominate politics. They are more extreme. We call them, the political science technical term is wingnuts in the
Mhm.
two parties. And yet they are the ones who run politics. They choose the candidates, they run the campaigns. And ordinary Americans sort of think, well, this is the way everybody is except me. So
Right.
I'm sort of a reasonable person, I feel this way, but I
Oh,
can talk
man.
out of it, and everything. But everybody else is sort of extreme, And so it's I don't know what to do about it, but a whole series of things have fed into this in the modern era.
So what you're saying, well, I'm curious, and your the Pew Research on the 3% of people that are doing 94 or 93% of the tweeting and retweeting. I'm not as shocked by that number, but I'm curious as to how many people are consuming those tweets. And, like you said, it might not be that so many, like I know most of my friends that anecdotally that use X or Twitter, primarily almost no one ever posts on it. Posting almost feels like you're posting if you're a creator. Like, every now and then, if you feel like you like something, you want to get some attention, you do a retweet. But by and large, it's interesting. I feel like the social media world has divided itself into creative accounts and consuming accounts. And I think the
Mhm.
majority of the population are primarily consumers, but that doesn't mean that they're not getting influenced or impact or even getting eyeballs on what these very extreme tiny percentage of people are saying.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And but notice what it does is it gives all these people consuming it a sense of everybody else is unlike me. And
Mhm.
I wouldn't. I mean, all I can say is the research on social media. I actually wrote a paper on this reviewing the literature some years ago, and I titled it "Social Media and Democracy: Much Ado About Nothing." And
Okay.
it turns out that, for example, all the studies of Facebook and so forth, and granted, there are so many. My students tell me about platforms now that I have no idea existed. Uh,
Sure. Me
uh,
too.
oh, what they typically found was that almost no one visited sites that were political.
That's
They
interesting.
weren't, the consumer class wasn't very big out there. In fact, one
Yeah.
economic study found that as soon as site was identified as political, people left it. That
Sure.
wasn't Facebook for or anything. I think, and for example, the most polarized people in the country turned out to be old people, and old people were the ones who were least likely to be on social media. So, I mean, the evidence that social media is a big part of this, I think, is really not out there. Admittedly, there are fringe groups that are on some of these little platforms, and they have find it easier to communicate with each other now than they could have 20, 30 years ago. Although it's also easier for the government to monitor them. I mean, I
Oh,
never
yeah.
know whether I count consumers or FBI agents, on these sites. But I think there are other factors at work that are much more important than social media. I mean, journalists love to say about how important the media are, but frankly, most academic research shows media don't matter very much. Political scientists say only a very rare campaign ad ever has any effect. Otherwise, these are consultants making a good living off the money that the
Sure.
politicians raise. Yeah.
Well, I think that is what made Trump stand out perhaps in his 26. Hey, everyone, real quick, if you're enjoying the show, click subscribe and rate the show 5 stars. Helps a ton. Thanks so much. 16, show, arrival to the scene is this guy changed what it meant to have a political conversation. All of a sudden, it turned into entertainment. And I think that, most people, for example, I'm certain because that people
Mhm.
have this kind of allergic or vehement response to a political website, but
Mhm.
I don't think they don't have as adverse of a reaction when they hear it from someone that's not associated in their head with being a particularly political figure. So if you're listening to a Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn podcast and you're not expecting
Yeah.
politics, but a lot of people form their opinions. A
Yes,
lot of
I
my I got a
disagree.
lot of my own too from this kind of medium,
Mhm.
and that's so that and the reach and influence that they have. I mean, there's
Mhm.
no doubt that that's enormous, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true, and it shocked everybody the last election, obviously. But yeah, the notion that could have a non-political program, and yet sort of the guy who appears on like Trump sort of seems like reasonable human being. And it's sort of, and if that's all the information you're getting, you're tuning out a whole lot of the more extreme stuff you're seeing on social media and regular media. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
Harris made a big mistake not going on to these other things to. It might not have worked.
Right.
She
Right. I mean, it could have been that she was avoiding a mistake.
I sort of watched a few episodes of Call Her Daddy, which is an eye-opening thing. Explain to your wife why you're watching a couple of 20-somethings talk about threesomes or foursomes.
Yeah.
It just sort of, I said, I'm doing research. Really, I am. And I thought, this isn't the demographic that she needed to reach, to win this election. This was not where she should have been. Well, yeah, I mean, I think I think one of the things that really came out of the last election was the non-political routes that can reach people. Sports, sort of the talk shows. I think, again, this is because as Democrats have gone upscale and become much more of a college educated, I mean, everybody in the
Right.
Democratic leadership squads these days is some college educated kid out there, and they don't watch Joe Rogan and they don't do all these things. And here's Barron Trump telling Dad, here's what you gotta get on. Here's all these sort of things that they've never heard of in the Democratic Party. And they
Sure.
think, well, who would, yeah. And they don't realize what small minorities they're not small minorities, but they're minorities that their party is appealing to. And the Republicans they seem to have stolen a jump on them. And the Democrats are always like one election behind in
Mhm.
modern year.
I'm curious. I actually, yeah, this might be a curveball, and I'm sorry. I'm just thinking of this while you're speaking. But what do you think of the current rise of these relatively contrarian figures like the gentleman, Zohran Mamdani in New York, who Trump seems to get along with pretty well now that they're both in office. They both seem to have some kind of, mutually respectful and kind relationship to one another in a really funny and entertaining way. But it feels like there's a new like. And what Mamdani did, which I believe I've read that he did, was that he went to all the areas in New York that had flipped for Trump and asked them what the issues were that caused them to flip. And he basically just ran on that direct feedback from that audience. And I'm wondering, is that someone that's always kind of been around politically but on the fringes, or is this a wave of new types of figures, I think, that are coming up in politics?
I don't know. I mean, we are in a somewhat different world than what we've been in. I think Trump sort of likes anybody who gives the impression of liking him. So if you go to Trump, they, oh, he's a good guy. He just sort of likes me. I think and it helps that Trump is totally non-ideological, that he decides what he wants to do based on how he's feeling that day, practically. And so he doesn't sort of come off as thinking Mondami or somebody else that is just crazy because of his positions. There's something I wanted to say before that I forgot
Sure.
to, and that is Trump is not the cause of all this. Trump is a beneficiary of trends that have been going on for a long time. And in a different era, I mean, granted, he starts out with name recognition and visibility, and that really helped. That
Right.
he got media immediately. People just said, what a ridiculous thing to do. And they started covering him all the time. But he was also coming in at a time when you look at the data, the white working class didn't just decide in 2016. They've been leaving the Democratic Party since the 60s, and they're really gone by the 80s. And
Mhm.
so he's sitting there sort of there's a market out there that is not being addressed by the two major parties, that they've
Right.
both sold the economy, certain big segments of the economy down the drain. They had 17 years of war in both parties, that basically the people are sort of really pissed and they don't know why exactly, just know. And then Trump comes along and says, here's the problem. It's all of these people, all these highly educated, know it all, et cetera, et cetera. And people
Mhm.
gravitate. I remember an anecdote. I was giving a talk at some of my friends at Harvard in 2016, and Trump had announced that he wasn't being taken seriously, really. And I went down to the square and got in a taxi, and the driver's a black guy. And this is before all the earphones and everything like that. Before we're driving away, and he says, "Do you mind if I keep listening to this on the radio?" I said, "I really like this guy." And I said, "No, go ahead." And so we're driving home, and he's saying he's listening to Trump. I realize that he's listening to Donald Trump talking, and every now and then he sort of laughs a little and hits the steering wheel, like, right on, man. And by the time I got home, I realized something which everybody's realized by now is Trump is capturing an attitude, not just the guy probably would have disagreed with all of Trump's policy positions, but boy, Trump was sticking it to the man. And this guy could see, yeah, well, wouldn't it be nice to stick it to the man in his life, you know? And I just think the sense that Trump is simply an instrument of sort of a left out segment of the population hitting back.
Yeah.
That Trump, that is non-programmatic. It's sort of impervious to his ridiculous personal behavior and everything. It's
Yeah.
just he drives the New York Times crazy. Is a feature, not a bug. You know, it's just sort of like the fact that they can say, "What kind of people could vote for this man?" They say, "We will." Fuck you. You know, it's just
Yeah.
that's part of what it is.
And that's what I think listen, I thought his 2024 or 2023, I guess, campaign was just something remarkable, was something that was like so cultural. And I think that post COVID and like what you mentioned, that the mentality of stick it to the man hasn't really manifested that strongly uh, I I mean, I only became politically aware really in 2015, 16.
Mhm.
So, I don't know much about beforehand, but that's what it felt like it was a culmination of. It felt like a culmination of everyone that was always kind of being shouted down at. And we can kind of work through the eras and the time, but some of the people that are being shouted at told to shut up for a long time kind of felt frustrated. And I'll tell you that I only voted once, and that was in 2016 for Trump. And part of the reason why I was not very aware politically, what was I was a creative writing and literature major in Binghamton University, and I was surrounded by people just screaming, at me constantly about my race, about my identity, about my ethics, and I felt like that was not a political. I felt at the time, hey, you don't know anything about me. Why are you yelling at me like this? And B, I'm going to show you, I'm not, like if you're pushing back on me, I'm going to push back on you. And I've since, I think, changed the way that I look at everything
Mhm.
a little bit, but that was really the driving force that made that even got me involved in politics to begin with, was this feeling of being culturally attacked or disparaged around, with my college surroundings. And I know that that you write quite a bit about this, so perhaps maybe you could elaborate on this, because I know that this tension is also not anything new in this country either. So
Yeah,
that
right.
certainly has a pattern too.
Well, this is, I was talking to some Europeans this week. And the other thing we should keep in mind is this is not just an American phenomenon, that this is happening all over the democratic world, the rise of these kinds of parties and these kinds of characters. And a large part of it is in all countries, the parties of the left, the social democratic parties, the labor parties, went upscale. The people used to talk about the British Labour Party having honest to goodness coal miners in parliament. Now it's a party of school teachers, and
Mhm.
the Democratic Party in the US used to have steel workers and auto workers. And
Sure.
now it's if you're union people, it's white collar unions. It's
It's what Springsteen started at and turned into,
yeah,
you know?
and all over. And so the effect of that was first a de-emphasis on economic. These people are more economically secure. They don't, their incomes are more secure. They don't lose their jobs in a recession the way blue collar union workers do. They're more affluent in general, so they can tolerate bad economic times. They still give lip service to old social
Mhm.
democratic economic stuff, but their priorities are really elsewhere. Their priorities are sort of, well, I mean, the term is often used luxury beliefs. I don't want to denigrate people's beliefs about abortion, gay rights, or anything like that, because those are sincere beliefs. But they're a different set of beliefs. Freddie de Beer, the British Marxist, writes, if you don't worry about abortion, if you worry about making the rent at the end of the month. And
Right.
that's the Labor parties, the Social Democrat parties used to be those kinds of parties. Now they're not. And so we can't just look at it in the U.S. We have to be looking at this all around the world. What, in fact, and my question to these people was, okay, what precipitated this? And nobody has any real good answer to that. Why did all these college educated people sort of go into those social democratic parties, and why didn't they go to the Republican Party? I mean, for a long time, the Republican Party in the U.S. was more liberal on social issues than Democrats. If somebody had asked me in 1960, abortion is going to be a real issue in years to come, who's going to be the pro-life party? I'd say, well, the Democrats, because they're the party of Catholics and Southern Baptists. Republicans have always
Wow.
blasé about their daughters getting, they send them to Switzerland to get, have a baby and everything. And it worked out complete opposite. And so I think it's one of the questions I think about often is just what led to the shape of party coalitions today that wouldn't have been obvious, I think, back 30, 40 years ago, even longer.
Well, what do you I'm curious, what do you think it is? Because I think that, I mean, and nothing had and I kind of wanted to save this for a little bit later, but nothing kind of demands that same type of party obedience than what Trump's campaign versus this current term turned out to be, and the only people that are a lot of people that are some of the people that are still behind Trump at this point are the ones that are behind Trump for the sake of him being Trump as opposed to the ideals that he ran on. And so that
Well,
happened too.
yeah. Okay, well, the thing people often forget too is that turnout in primaries is very low. Typical House primary that's hotly contested is under 10%. And the people who turn out are the wingnuts. And so it doesn't take much to enforce that kind of discipline in a primary. And so as long as MAGA is, I don't know, 35% to 40% of the Republican Party, and virtually everyone turning out in this a MAGA type, he can enforce that kind of discipline. But it's been pretty rare in American politics. But it is just a function of the primary process. I often say my generation made a mistake in the 60s, a big mistake that they got so upset about Mayor Daley and the old
Mhm.
politics. They said, no, we're going to transform politics. It's going to be government in the sunshine, power to the people, some feasible participation. The problem is when you threw open the doors to politics, it wasn't ordinary citizens who walked in. It was the wingnuts. It was the 15% who really, and
Right.
we basically took power away from people whose interest was to win elections. We win elections because we keep control of jobs, contracts, and so forth. And so they cater to the electorate. They say, what are people concerned about? Okay, let's meet them where they are. Suddenly, you're getting people who say, no, the purpose of being in politics is to save the whales or end abortion or stop gun, sort of. And they don't care about winning. Well, they care about winning. But it's more important that you look good and sort of maintain your position than it is to sort of win in so many cases. And they delude themselves. They say, well, these are really popular positions. They ignore data and say, no, these are really not popular positions. And right now we're looking at a situation where any time in American history, an administration with these kinds of problems going on, an unpopular war, inflation, gas prices, they're looking at a wipeout. And
Right.
what might protect them from a wipeout? The incompetence of the Democratic Party. Yeah, it's just sort of like,
Do you think so?
people want to lose? It just sort of, yeah.
I think you're putting yourself in dangerously risky waters at this
I'm
point.
retiring, so I don't care.
Sorry? Oh, yeah, not you. No, I'm not talking
No,
about you. I apologize.
no.
I mean, I if I were this administration, right, and I was running the way I was running, and the messages that I was sending were the messages that I was going, explicitly saying, and then doing the 180, and there's a million different examples: war, Epstein, inflation, like you said, the economy, gas prices, stuff like that. That were explicit promises, and then you say, well, I didn't keep any of those promises, but like at least I'm not the Democrats. I mean, like I don't think that you're making much of an argument for yourself that you're much better, you know? I think that part of the reason why Trump, I think, won in 2024, and perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps this is just my thought, it felt like the Democrats shot themselves in the foot, didn't put them like, and didn't even wanna give themselves even a fair chance after Biden bowed out. They kind of just
Mhm.
kind of threw in the towel at that point. It almost feels like Trump's in now and, he's making the most of what he could, and he's making the best that he could and the money that he can make and the deals that he can make, and then he says, "You know what? I can't do anything after this anyway, so, who cares what happens after that?" And I don't know what you think of the opportunity, JD Vance's political future or Mark Rubio's political future, but I don't know if people will look at them the same way they did 2 or 3 years ago. Do you?
Oh, I do not handicap anybody this far in advance of an election. I mean, the old saying is a week in politics is a long time. 3 years is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So, having been teaching for a career, I collect anecdotes. In 1976, well, actually, it was 1974, Help decided to set up their trial heats. So they canvassed Democratic officials and said, who are the possible Democratic candidates in 1976? Came up with 30 some names, which did not include Jimmy Carter.
Whoa.
So you want to predict or say somebody's chances 2 years, 3 years ahead of time? Go right ahead. I'm not
Right.
in the
You wanna hear my what's the word for it? The under the surprise, the shock candidate that I'm expecting.
Sure.
I'm thinking that Stephen A. Smith, the basketball commentator, is going to be the Democratic nominee, and I think that he has the advantage of spending 20 years on television, live debating, and whipping whatever points he wants out of his ass, essentially, and seeing it with a lot of authority. And I don't think that he doesn't have any previous political history that he could completely divorce himself from anyone's previous failures. And he's an entertaining, articulate, black, talented guy. I think that I would I would not count him out by any stretch of the imagination.
One wouldn't either. No, I agree for all the reasons you said. And I'd add to that that he is at times taken politically moderate positions on
Mhm.
some issues
Sure.
out there. So again, he'd be perceived as not as extreme as many other Democrats in the race. So if he could sort of, like Trump, get through the primaries with a reasonably moderate platform. And that, by the way, some of Trump's appeal too was people knew he didn't really care. He'd been all over the map on abortions and stuff like that. So people said, well, he doesn't really care.
Sure.
It's not like Spence or somebody like that. Or not, Pence. He doesn't really care. He won't push it that hard. So he didn't scare people. I think Stephen A. Smith would have the same quality, that he seems like a middle of the road, reasonable guy. And he'd appeal to the marginal voter. They can be exaggerated, but the young, especially men who aren't as educated, he makes sense when he talks. You're right. He has all these other advantages like a Trump. And it probably couldn't do any worse, but what was most significant about 2016 was about 2024 was the break, and it had been going on for years ahead of time, the break of ethnic minorities toward Republicans, yeah, Hispanics especially, but even black, especially males,
Mhm.
Asians, or just across the board. And a lot of it, I think, went back. And I was talking to somebody else last week about, is there any good research on this? But the sense that these were groups that did really well during Trump's first administration until the pandemic came along. Unemployment was at all-time lows. And so when Trump came back in, I think there was a sense of, well, why should I be afraid of him now when things seemed okay when he was, in office? So I think that sort of sense of everything's going to be okay was one of the things. And then also, as people pointed out, the cultural conservatism of a lot of these groups, more so than a lot of the more standard Democratic groups, I think led to some of that as well.
Right, right. I want to know what your thoughts are on journalism as it comes to politics a little bit, especially as time goes on. Again, we kind of touched on this a little bit with the podcast and X. Establishment media, I feel like at this point kind of serves to essentially validate everything that people say online. Like they just kind of select stories, and if they choose to run it, then it seems like a validation of previously broken story online. Do you think that they're going to find a way to pivot and re-enter the conversation with the same level of force, or do you think that this establishment is going to be put aside and then a new industry is going to pick up, and that's already been the end of it?
Well,
'Cause I'm thinking about, like, for example, underground magazines, right, or underground newspapers
yeah,
that were popular in the '60s and '70s, and at
yeah.
a certain point, when they didn't need to, like, exist anymore, they kinda just went away, or, they
Mhm.
became what Rolling Stone is today, or, you have a lot of these, historically hippie or out there,
Yeah,
outlets that
yeah.
that change their tune, and then and then that kind of leads the way to a new form.
Well, hesitate. I simply don't predict the future because we're lousy at it. We're good at analyzing the past in some cases, but not at predicting the future. But what I'll say about journalism is we were talking about the transformation of social democratic parties. And
Mhm.
the same thing happened in journalism that until about, I don't know, the 60s, Woodward and Bernstein, maybe, journalists they kind of were out there drinking in the bars with the politicians, sort of hitting the streets. They were themselves working class guys, and so they were paid very well. And then we saw a whole transfer over the course of a generation or two. Suddenly, Harvard students are going into journalism and stuff like that and
Right.
becoming journalists. And again, they lost track or lost touch with the grassroots. They lost touch with. I mean, how many journalists nowadays they call up political science professors and politicians and sort of get the story. They're not out there. They're in Iowa during the primary season, and they go to a few places where everybody's on, everybody else is going, and they're not out there sort of in like right now. or well, now we're getting into the primary season, but sort of middle of next year, sort of that they don't have the same contact. I think of journalists like Mike Royko in Chicago, and there were Boston people and people like that. And they had their fingers on the pulse of what was going on much more than I think journalists today do. And they call you up and ask about the latest poll on something. You think, well, go out there and talk to real people. Or God, tell my students, if you have spare time, do not listen to NPR. Just sort of, I mean, this is just these bubbles that people tend to listen to. You're becoming informed. No, you're not. Go to Costco and walk around and just listen to what people are talking about in the owls.
That's it. By the way, that is where I get my sense for a lot of many times as to what people think about anything is I love microbreweries and I talk to people in Costco and I do think and, and I people for the podcast and I'm talking about people and things come up inevitably in conversations and you just get an idea as to what people really think and it makes this other form of journalism, which it would be reporting based on a poll hypothetically as opposed to something a little bit more grassroots, it makes that all the more glaringly shallow. It makes it all the more obvious that it's not there, which I think actually would probably emphasize the point that it feels like the people that are on podcasts that are posting 3 or 4 episodes a week that are talking to 3 or 4 different human beings a week, and it doesn't all have to be Joe Rogan level, guest that every other episode is Elon Musk or a senator or a president or something like that. But listen to a story about a guy that has a plumber with his own business and what he has to think. And we think about the guy that's a high school teacher for the last 20 years and see what they think. And I think a lot of times what at least what I've found is that, again, circle back all the way to the beginning of our conversation, is everyone tends to agree on a lot of things. Everyone tends to be very, very principled. And it's funny because you can even tell in the conversation I've found that when it comes to a topic that's been pushed artificially or not into the zeitgeist, with a lot of effort, those conversations aren't really conversations as much as people kind of spitting out what they've heard at one another relative to, hey, what do you think about the price of groceries?
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I hope that journalism changes. I think that I look at the podcast world almost like the underground newspaper world back in the day. And I think that there's a lot of political similarities and cultural similarities today between the late 60s and between today and the late 60s, as far as music, as far as I think this embrace of Eastern culture and a little bit more alternative, less establishment, ideology. I'm reading a book now by a gentleman named David Kaiser called How the Hippies Saved Physics. And one of the premises of the book is that they kind of provided this perspective that the establishment, during the Cold War and World War II, they looked at science to be weaponized, and we needed some other source, some other guiding star that would say, hey, there's something weird going on with consciousness. There's something weird going on with quantum physics. There's something, there's something odd going on here. And because it wasn't necessarily immediately relevant to weapons manufacturing or the Cold War or the Manhattan Project, it was kind of cast aside. So I think that there's a lot of I feel like there's a lot of cultural similarities in that we're at a very interesting tipping point in time.
We'll see. You'll be around long enough to see whether you're right.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a little nervous. So, can you tell me about some of so you said that politics were always, I guess, were never this I said that they were always this extreme or in people's lives. You said that it wasn't the case. That's a misunderstanding. Can you tell me about some, I guess, big moments throughout the decades that really swooped up the nation that I don't think that people don't remember anymore? Because I think that we as a nation have very short memory. And to bring back, to recall these big cultural moments, I think that if we study them or think about them, we could see a lot of parallels to the present.
You mean like talking about my last chapter, talking about the 60s and so forth? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of, it is surprising to somebody like me to look and see how young the population is, relatively speaking, that the vast majority of the population was born after the 60s. So talk about how we've had a couple of decades where even though we thought of ourselves as polarized, like with Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, when you look back on it, they reformed Social Security, they passed comprehensive immigration reform, they saved Social Security for a generation. That generation's up now. They did a lot of stuff, even though they complained, yelled at each other all the time. A lot of stuff got done. There was peace, no war after Vietnam. The economists talk about the great moderation, how we simply could control the business cycle and we would no longer have these big recessions, et cetera, et cetera. Things were good. And I pointed out, I said, I went to college in 1968. No, I went to college in 1964. And my whole college experience was the country was engulfed in flames, that there were
Mhm.
riots, people died,
Ohio.
dozens killed. The Democratic administration sent tanks and the National Guard into the cities, and it'd be put under martial law. The Marines, the Washington, D.C. riots, I point out,
What
they
was the
didn't make
what
it
were
to
the
the Capitol.
conversations like when that was happening?
Yeah,
What were the people like when that was happening? Was that like
But
an
the people were saying, "What is wrong with the Democrats?" That was what led to Richard Nixon. It was what led to George Wallace got like close to 14% of the vote. And a violent segregationist gets close to 14% of the vote in 1968. And so the country's coming apart. There are actually books with that title, Coming Apart in the 60s. And so that one, the point I make is, if you look through American history, that's a more representative time than the 80s and 90s, frankly, that we had the Red Scare, we had 70 decades of labor violence were
Mhm.
shot. Women and children were shot. People were executed as subversives and so forth. And so this has always been a violent country, frankly. And it just has been. And we've sort of lost track of that. So we now have a much higher standard of what politics should be like. And if you were alive during, well, if you're my generation, basically, you remember those days. Actually, we tend to forget a lot of it, but when you sort of look back, you do remember those days. And I was working a steel mill in the summers. They they the economy was good. They were hiring college boys whose relatives were employed just make money in the summer. We're making twice
That's
the minimum
awesome.
wage. And I'd listen to the men talking. They're starting to talk about voting for Nixon. These are all United Steelworkers. They're talking
Mhm.
about voting for George Wallace. It's just our trucks would send a truck to Philadelphia, come back the next day. They couldn't get into the city. The cops turned them around and sent them back. And so the people were just being shaken out of their existing sort of New Deal democratic habits. And that was the start of just sort of like basically a long decade and a half of real violence. But if you look back through American history, those decades have been actually closer to the norm than the sort of very peaceful 80s and 90s. And it sort of ends with 2001. It ends with, I think, had George Bush not come out and said, I'm a war president, but I'm a national unity president, and said it's time for partisan divisions to go, and we're going to not push any kind of partisan legislation. But he didn't seize the opportunity. Whether that would have stopped the relentless surge toward party sorting and the polarization we have now, I don't know, but it certainly didn't help it. Uh,
What do you think happened? Do you think that you think that 9/11 just brought everyone together very briefly, and then we all remember that, this doesn't happen very often and, let's get back to business as usual? You think it's just a collective short memory?
I think 9/11 really did bring us together. His approval ratings were way high, and
Yeah.
the Republicans and Democrats sang together on the steps of the Capitol, and
Really?
it was a great moment. I mean, kids were buying American flags, and
Right.
college kids. Boy, talk about that in the '60s. College kids buying American flags, but it didn't last. And I think he could have seized the moment better than he did. It was a lost opportunity, as I said. But I don't know, maybe the other forces are just too strong, other forces at least in the society.
Yeah.
But it's a sort of always fun to look back and say at these historical moments and say, could they have gone differently?
I wanna continue down that path in a minute, but I wanna ask, have you watched the movie on Netflix, The Trial of the Chicago 7?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Mm,
I would recommend it. Obviously, it must be something living through it as you're in
yeah,
college while that's
yeah,
going on,
yeah.
but, that movie really, really shook up my perception of the entire, I think, political era and conversation, and what
Mm.
I'm curious about is if they said that the Democrats were the ones at that point who fumbled it so much that they brought Richard Nixon in, most of the campus students that were protesting were leftists, weren't they? And weren't
Yes,
they were. So it was like there's almost like this internal civil war between the party at that
It wasn't between the parties. That's
between the
another,
party.
when I'm talking about sorting versus polarization, I make that point of that
Right.
example that parties can either dampen or amplify polarization. And basically, what happened in the 60s, there was polarization, well, first civil rights. But yet you looked at the most pro civil rights party people were Democrats, and the most anti civil rights people were also Democrats. And so they had cross party coalitions in the Congress. There probably was in between. The same thing happened in Vietnam. The anti war people, the protesters in the streets were Democrats, and the police who beat them up were Democrats. And
Wow. I
Republicans.
didn't know that.
Oh,
That's not
oh,
emphasized
yeah.
very
The
often.
Chicago police are all Democrats. They're all sure. It was the blue collar types. I show in class clips of the rioting in Chicago and the protesters being beaten up. Just,
Mhm.
I mean, people today say we're going to sue the police if they use tear gas on us. Here's what happened in the 60s with the police dogs and the batons and people. This is the kind of the way police used to behave, or again, people were, you know, the December, January 6th was an ugly incident. There's no question about it and everything. But I also think this could have been avoided if we'd had sort of decently prepared authorities that Trump, Chicago, the convention was going to Chicago, Mayor Daley mobilized 4,000 law enforcement people.
Right.
National Guard, Chicago Police, Illinois State Guard, everything. And they were met with a show of force, and literally it was violent, but had,
Yeah.
whereas what I read about the Washington, D.C. insurgency or so-called insurgency is that they asked for extra police reinforcements and they were denied because the optics didn't look good, and some of the FBI information did about the Proud Boys' involvement didn't get to the police. And so you have this couple of dozen poor outmanned police trying to stop this unruly mob. Now, had
Mhm.
Mayor Daley been in charge of that, there would have been some cracked heads right at the beginning, and that would have been it. It would have
Sure.
gone home. And so, I mean, in part, it was a failure of authority. And I think there's this reluctance to use authority in today's
Yeah.
society, even when it's justified.
Well, because you feel like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, you know?
Yeah.
Think about Trump's, and again, objectively, it's very interesting. Yeah, I think that his whole attempts to deport people kind of had a very similar effect on the party. It was almost like damned if you do and damned if you don't. Some people were like, the second they started, you're like, whoa, 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 what are you doing? What are you going to run into people in parking lots and in Walmart and in Home Depot? And on the other hand, you're like, well, didn't you say you wanted that? Like I
Yeah.
don't know what you want me to tell you. And I don't actually. It's funny. Felt I never felt like I felt extremely strongly. I didn't feel like I felt like I was conflicted. And I felt like I was essentially, it would have been much easier for me to just repeat what my favorite person had felt
Mhm.
rather than really think about it, which I still don't know what I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
the other thing, all the Minnesota tragedies and so forth, they were a good example of what I talked about, overreach of the parties, that we haven't talked about this, but because you have these two now, they're much more internally disciplined and much more similar to internally and much more different externally, that neither one has a majority, that
mhm.
each party is a minority party, and yet one wins. The difference we can talk about is about other postal representation systems. One of them wins. And if they win a trifecta, if they win all three, there is this pressure internally to do everything your base
Yes.
wants. And that's not what your electoral majority wanted. There are a lot of people who, so people say, yes, we want the border under control. We want to stop the flooding of this. But then Stephen Miller and the rest of the base come in and they say, okay, and they unleash ICE in the cities and stuff. And people say, I didn't mean for my nanny to be deported, sort of like that. It's this overreach, this quality about let's go to the extreme. And the result is you lose the next election when all the people who thought, yeah, this is just not what I voted for. This is way too much. And so we're locked in this cycle. And if the Democrats win the next election, well, they will probably draw the wrong lesson, saying, okay, the country has moved left, and now it's our time to do all these things. And the country will say, no.
Do you think it's just not do you think it's just not possible? I guess that just by and you talked about these greater forces, it's just not possible to make people happy, I think. Like I'm curious, or like to even get everything you want done is got to be impossible. And like I think to myself, and I was a little disappointed by Thomas Massey losing recently, and I liked him. I think that he's
Yeah.
really got, again, this kind of common sense. He doesn't throw himself into too many cultural or types of problems. He's much more practical, and he's much more libertarian in his thinking. But he was running. I mean, basically, the entire thing that he's saying was everything Trump was saying in his, in his while he was running during his campaign. And I mean, like, as much as would love to say that, I would love for Massey to win and do everything he's saying. I don't think he's gonna like, even if he did win tomorrow, I don't know he'd be able to implement anything differently than anyone else. Like, the same forces that prevent everything, from happening, every president from doing what they promise, and kinda continuing the same agenda for the last 25 years, one way or the other, which is global general expansionism and, kind of making the sacrifice with the economy at home and really kind of creating this, I mean, from the economy's perspective, this enormous pit of debt that we keep on kicking the can down the road and trying to find other forms of debt to temporarily serve as a placeholder while we panic about the rest of our debts. No matter what anyone campaigns on, it doesn't change. So it doesn't make a difference whether you're left or right. And actually, this is where I kind of wanted to go into the bigger forces, which is feels like left and right doesn't make a difference as much as this different classes of power and influence in society and just two tiers of justice and power in society.
That was a lot to digest. I'm a data guy. Yeah, I will
Okay.
pick up I will
I hope everything I said was kinda true.
I'll pick up on one point you said, though, about you can't please everybody, and that is certainly true, and certainly true in a big, heterogeneous country like we have. But it is possible to please more people than we are now.
Yeah.
That I could give you a national referendum on abortion that would get 60 or 65%. I could give you a national referendum on trans issues and so forth, on guns, etc. Not everybody's happy. No, and certainly like Massachusetts might be even more unhappy than Mississippi. There's this kind of regional variation. But nevertheless, a lot of people would say, yeah, good enough. Let's move on. We don't have a system now that lets people get to those kinds of positions. We have one that says these 35% want this. And the other party says, well, these 35% want this. And nobody will ever worry about the 30% in the middle.
I mean, the people that try to pick them up inevitably start doing well and then kinda get swallowed up by the next party. I mean, RFK's run, I think he was gonna end up hurting Trump, I believe was the projection, and so he said, "Well, instead of me hurting you, you and I seem to align on things like MAHA and everything, and other practical issues, so let's combine our,
Yeah.
our bases." And is this new? Why is it 30%
No, that's
always being
politics.
forgotten? Why, like,
That's politics.
how do
That's
we
just
get
what
that?
it is. Yeah.
And no third party is able to pop up.
Mhm.
What's to prevent a third party from coming into play?
Well, institutionally, I mean, we talked a little earlier. Institutionally, you can have a third candidate. You can basically have a Perot, 19% of the vote, and he would have done better had he not sort of gone off the rails in midsummer. Actually, there was a point at which some people they make a mistake. They say third parties can't win. Well, it's actually the case is the third place people can't win. That there was a period in which Perot was ahead of Clinton. Now, had that's persisted through the campaign, then at the end, people would have been saying, do you vote for Clinton or you vote for the next best guy for you, Perot? And so it could have gone the other way. But in general, talk about congressional or senatorial, what good does it do to elect, a libertarian like Thomas Massey if they're one out of 435? So basically, it's the two party system is partly a function of the fact that we have this regionally the system and it's a single member system. In France is my favorite example. I had probably different analysis the last election, but at one point I looked at France at the parliament. They had 17 parties that had seats in the
Whoa.
yeah. There was something called the Hunters Party that had 3 seats. So if you're a gun nut in France, you can just vote for the Hunters Party, sort of like. So now they
And they
get
make coalition? How do they
your
win?
vote counts no matter what. I mean, if as long as you
Right.
get enough to get a seat, your vote counts. It's not wasted. Whereas in a single member district system, well, first past the post system like we have, your vote is just wasted unless you vote for one of the two leading candidates. So you would have to change to a proportional representation system, which this day I'm increasingly in favor of that. But it would take something dramatically different like that to really a third party to be viable. Unless one of the other party, I mean, okay, we did have the one case in American history when the Whigs simply came apart and
Really?
Republicans replace them. But that's basically it. Typically, one of the major parties or the other absorbs the appeal. I mean, basically, Newt Gingrich looked at Perot's showing and said, "Okay, let's pick this. Let's pick this. The polls show that's popular," and he ushered in the Republican majority in 1994. And that's
Mhm.
the typical pattern is one party or the other says, "Okay, we got to move to get these people."
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because I almost wish that Trump won as not a Republican to kind of force that to happen. Because I think Trump did say while he was running that, like,
Yeah.
"Okay, like, if I'm not the candidate, then I'll just run as independent," and RFK, again, I think he had a very interesting campaign. He ended up being a little bit he was a real target for, like, literally every kind of bizarre, wacky story you could imagine, and I don't know if you know Tim Dillon is the comedian. He has a podcast, he talks about politics a lot, and it's very funny. He's like, "Who would have thought that of Trump's entire cabinet, that the least controversial person this entire time is RFK Jr.?" He's like, you have Kash Patel running around getting drunk with hockey players. You have Pam Bondi lying about the Epstein files, like, and RFK's in the corner talking about he killed a bear in Central Park one time, and everyone's like, "You didn't have to volunteer that information. That's okay. You could just focus on the food dyes for now."
Okay.
So it's but he really did run. I think that, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on his campaign, but, like, there's this idea that right before there's, like, a big guy blowing through one of the 2 systems, one of the systems will swallow them up, will, like, take them. Okay, fine, like, you obviously have collected enough of the audience that will accept you. But I think the ultimate sticking it to the man, the way that we described it earlier, would be to say, "I'm sticking it to you Republicans and Democrats, and, you got we're sick of this game. It's crazy."
Yeah, I think that's one of those interesting counterfactuals. In 2016, was the Republican establishment had managed to beat back the insurgency and picked someone else, and Trump would have said, "I've been frozen out. I was your voice, and they don't want you." It might have been a real race in that case.
Sure. Yeah, that would've been very cool. And, I wanna talk about also, and I think I'm more exposed to this because I tend to consume more right to libertarian leaning content, but I'm obviously noticing a big divide in the right. But something that I read in Unstable Majorities was how you're more inclined to see how your party is split, and I don't really consider myself a true Republican by any means, especially because I haven't really voted for them, and I can't approve of, a lot of what's going on, but I'm more inclined to lean that way. How has the left been split recently? I know how the right's been split about issues like Israel and First Amendment and,
Yeah.
everything that is in the news today. How's the left been split, and what are they looking like at this point?
Well, again, you go back and look at the public opinion data. For a long time, the general feeling was Republicans had moved farther right, the Democrats had moved less. But if you look at the data, starting in about 2008, it was actually, no, 2004, because it's before Obama, it begins. The Democrats began to move sharply left on social issues, on
Mhm.
immigration, on gay rights and so forth, and abortion. And I mean, really, John Murdoch, there's a British, can't remember his full name, who does data scientist, and he's got this really fantastic graph that just shows Republicans and Democrats, it's only the Democrats go this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think the feeling now is, and the fact is, basically for about 30 years, the population as a whole has seen the Republicans as closer to them than the Democrats.
Really?
And yeah, I mean, in some cases, not very far, even in 2024, just ever so slightly. But the Democratic split is primarily on social issues. To one group that takes extreme in race, it's the woke stuff, or it's the DEI. On
Mhm.
transit, it's the most extreme position. Abortion, most extreme, anything goes. There's voters who say, no, you have to compromise on these issues to have any real chance of winning. And I mean, I think there is sort of a there, I mean, it's silly to, it's one thing to keep advocating for an extreme position, but to keep running candidates when you're down 70-30 on an issue, that's just not, the purpose of parties is to win elections. And it's better that you win the election than the other team wins the election. But there are a lot of
Sure.
people who don't happen to feel that. Yeah.
Well, I
And
would
it
say
gives,
about the Democratic
it's,
Party. Sorry. Go ahead, please, I'm sorry.
go ahead. Good.
Oh, I was gonna say that about the Democratic Party, it's interesting because it feels like they attempted to try to throw money at problems, especially with Harris campaign, that, they just spent an enormous amount of money and kind of and because she did have a little bit more of that corporate type of backing, and I mean, I think she blew through over $1 billion over the course of her couple of month campaign, which is bonkers, truly, truly crazy.
Well,
On one hand, you say it doesn't work. On the other hand, and I don't know what you think of this, but Thomas Massey basically says the reason why he lost was because they spent $25 million on ads, and everyone that wasn't out in the street or wasn't talking to people in Costco were basically, that weren't aware of these issues, that were sitting at home watching, Fox News or whatever, were basically getting bought off essentially, right, with these ads. So it's interesting because when you count too much on money, it doesn't work.
mm,
But like you can count on money quite a bit to get you pretty far. And even if it's issues that, people aren't that isn't very popular, there's enough. I don't know what the word is, the voters that don't consume politics all the time. I don't want to call them, are they low informed voters? Is that what they're called?
for the low
Are they
information.
low information voters? Yeah. They're the ones that money could really buy, I imagine, right?
Well, they don't watch the ads, so and that's the reason they don't appear. Yeah. You
Well,
might
they're
be
getting
going to
hit
the
with it one
bathroom
way or
when
the other.
they go to the bathroom when the ad comes on. But no, you're right about the sort of the unobtrusive sort of the things like Rogan and so forth, and the targeted ads. One of the things there've been some articles written on this about the Republicans actually spent their monies very efficiently on targeting, micro targeting, on reaching media outlets that reached a certain segment of the population, very small, which wouldn't be considered economical. There's also one of my colleagues does very good work, Adam Bonica, on how much the Democrats are wasting. In the sense that most of the money that is raised, and he says it's a high proportion, is simply engulfed by the consultant class who pay themselves and run the polling firms and run and make the ads and pay the media and so forth. And a surprisingly small fraction of what you give to a Democratic Party or candidate actually reaches the campaign. It actually reaches the person who's out there trying to knock on doors and reach voters and so forth. That there's a sort of a parasitical, frankly, class of people whose livelihood depends on keeping things the way they are, regardless of research that shows that it's not very effective.
Yeah. I think that's what that's pretty much called, is kind of the corporatization of America. It's kind of
Uh,
it's kind of what it's been feeling like, and it feels like it's funny because obviously one of the main principles that the country is founded on is separation of church and state. But I think we have to make I don't know about an amendment, but addition, separation of state and corporation, because I think that we can see again, it's not even in the last 20 years, it's been for a long time. The relationship between state and corporation is just something that doesn't lend either one of them to any kind of level of accountability or a real transparency. And, you're obviously never going to have complete transparency, but the way that they kind of work in union with one another and lockstep with one another, it's very easy to hide, where the money's going. And I think that's really what politics has been hurtling towards for the last 50, 60 years. Really, I think since the Cold War. What do you think about that?
well, it's not just corporations, it's also billionaires just who made their money and just sort of can you might be a liberal billionaire or you might be a conservative billionaire, but they both have we're running right now here, Tom Steyer, who was sort of a megalomaniac liberal, or one columnist characterized him as a coal billionaire running for as a communist. So I mean, you have, it's not just corporations; it's rich people in general. And again, going back to social democratic parties, it used to be the case that organized labor was a counterweight to the corporations. But as
Mhm.
labor deteriorated and weakened, then the Democrats began to go upscale as well. And so basically, I think the neocons, not the neocons, the Clinton wing of the party. What do you call them? The neoliberals.
Mm.
They
Sure.
recently became pro-business. And to a certain extent, that's good. I mean, business is the hiring machine and the machine for prosperity. But so you don't want to be sort of automatically anti-business. But they pretty soon you had almost two parties in a sense that were sort of interested in American business and corporations. And, the Democrats have plenty of, plenty of hands in the pockets of business corporations now, as well as the Republicans. Yeah, so this is a problem. And the whole campaign finance system has been just, worse and worse. I mean, everything
It's
people
out of
try to
control.
do sort of just makes it worse, and so it's a total mess.
Yeah. Can you explain to anyone that might not know what a super PAC is and how they work and how they have an influence in
Yeah.
politics?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's all sorts of organizational structures out there that are organized under different provisions of the Internal Revenue Code and have different anonymity and disclosure requirements. And what people are really worried about now is the dark money. You can have a sort of an organization that takes its payments from other organizations and therefore does not have to disclose who those other organizations got their money from.
Mhm.
So it's a way of laundering the money, but you're sort of laundering the chain, the accountability change, or the visibility change. And it's just one thing. There are so many creative lawyers out there, and there's so much incentive that no matter what you try to do legally, it's just I've often said that the only reform I could think of that would absolutely, wipe out the system would be to say the only people who can contribute to a race are people eligible to vote in that race. No organizations of any kind, labor
Oh, that's
unions,
interesting.
corporations, et cetera. If you're in a congressional race, only the people in that district can vote in that race. So it'd be not very much spent in little places in Kansas, a lot spent in places in Manhattan. Now, the problem with that, and so you'd have strict penalties and so forth if there somebody outside group is sort of paying a school teacher to give millions of dollars. Well,
Yeah.
you can check on that. But now that would give you a totally sort of disorganized party system the way we complained about it back in Jimmy Carter's day when nobody ran anything. It's sort of what chaos. So I mean, in a sense, we've gone from one case where the parts, like in 50 years, where the parties didn't matter, they were totally disorganized, to ones where the parties, everybody agrees, are too strong. And the financing is part of that, but I don't know how to get out of it.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, I like that but I think that your problem that you're describing is probably less of a problem than, treating giving the corporation a right as as an individual, and saying that any money that you give is basically freedom of speech. I don't think that corporations should get freedom of speech the same way,
Yeah,
and I
that
think
was
that
a
that leads
mistake.
to a lot bigger
Yeah.
problems and
I get
the other problems
back and
come out.
yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, they're not persons. Yeah, they're not persons. It's just that was a mistake in court decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, we got a lot of work to do. We got a lot of work to
Yeah,
do, and,
yeah.
I
You
my
do, now
generation.
retired.
That's
Yeah,
right, you're
right.
retired. Congratulations. Congratulations, you get to watch from the side and hopefully continue commenting because, yeah, I think that like I mentioned to you when we first started the conversation, and when I'm reading your book, it felt more like someone tilting their head and analyzing out of curiosity the insanity of a system instead of, being rah-rah one way or the other. And I think that part of the problem is also that America is just so big. It's so enormous. And I mean, you think about what the size we were when we were just the 13 colonies and and you think about what the American empire is and, establishing democracy around the world in our own image. And we don't think about what that costs. You don't think about what it takes to get there. We don't even think about what that means very often.
Yep. Again, an anecdote, people in other countries know a lot more about foreign affairs than Americans do. Americans sort of just go on with their lives. Who cares what's going on in Britain or Germany or Japan or anything else? Whereas in other countries, but I was on a State Department sent me to Germany for a lecture tour, and one of the German military people told me that he'd spent a year, I think, in Chicago, and he said that the distance from Chicago to St. Louis was larger than the distance from any point in Germany to a border. Yeah. Wow. So no wonder you know about what your neighbors are doing. It's just yeah, so just the sheer vastness of the protected by oceans. And yeah, so we're just historically just don't pay much attention and people would rather I've always said that Americans are reluctant internationalists. They're not isolationists. They know we sort of have to lead, but they're not happy about it. And again, Trump picked up I mean, I was talking about this in the '90s when I was in Germany, that they were asking, "What are you gonna do about Kosovo?" I said, "What do you mean we? Get in your tanks and drive them to Kosovo. You're right in their backyard."
Mhm.
And if that was the sense, and I think Trump picked up on that. That was one to see, why are we so involved all around the world? They talk about their gleaming infrastructure and their great social safety net. Well, yeah, we're paying for their defense. So
That's right.
why? I mean, I think his sort of putting NATO on notice that you guys have to pay, I think that's very popular. That's one of these, positions he took, and frankly, I agree with that. I mean, they
All these positions
work
in
for
theory are
you.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, they were wonderful in theory. You gotta just get them implemented, and you gotta and we're fine and it's interesting because all of Trump's executive orders, I don't know exactly how they work, but can the next president just cancel them out with another executive order? How does that work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what basically the Europeans have come up in a way that I think we wouldn't have predicted in terms of increasing their defense budgets and getting serious about it. And I think even if the next president is different, they've sort of gotten a wake up call that the
Yeah.
next president could reverse it again. So you better sort of have your own defense and you better have your own defense
I think
establishment.
we're learning. I think we're learning as a country. I'm doing. I think we're learning. I think that our recent meeting with China was a real concession moment where it's more
Mhm.
of a competition rather than a rivalry.
Yeah.
And let's collaborate because I think that I think both countries realize how dependent they are on one another. And I think that America has realized that I think that Trump has probably realized that China's probably overtaken America at this point on the
Mhm.
world stage, whether that be in influence or whether that be in military capacity or soft influence for sure. I mean, like, I think that, one of the biggest problems that the Chinese have is that their infrastructure isn't as good as American infrastructure. But part of the problem that Americans have is that everyone's sick of dealing with them for the last 70 years. So
Uh,
I think that this war with Iran made us realize we're not as strong as I think we are either.
yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that I think we're gonna be a little bit more humbled in the coming years, I hope.
Yeah, in general, but it's also the case that China has real problems which are not sufficiently recognized by, in general, the United States, that they have a very high youth unemployment rate. Their population stability is going to turn down fairly soon.
Mhm.
Sort of again, the too many retirees, not enough workers.
Mhm.
That some of the people who study revolution and so forth argue that you really get unrest when aspirations are unsatisfied and people have a long period of high aspiration doing well and then suddenly it stops. And that
Yeah.
describes the Chinese situation pretty well. So
And the American.
we may be looking at only their strong side and sort of not paying enough attention to some of the problems in the domestic side.
Yeah, but I mean, you're correct, totally. They lifted 350 million people out of poverty, and I saw
Yeah.
a recent article that I think like 40% of Gen Z and younger are buying food on buy now, pay later plans. Like economically, Americans are really like we can't buy food. We're really hurting. So I
Yeah.
think that I think we have a little bit of that problem too.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know if you saw these recent graduations. Every time anyone brings up AI, all the graduates start booing.
Right. Yeah.
That's not an accident.
Except Stanford, where they're all going into AI.
Right,
No,
except for
no, I'm
Stanford, that's
joking.
right.
Yeah, you're right.
Anyway, retired Professor Morris Fiorina,
Not yet.
thank you so much. Thank you so much for the time. This is so much fun.
Okay.
I really enjoyed this conversation, and you give me a lot to think about, a lot to panic about, I think, but a lot to rebuild, I think. I think that one good thing that comes from this is you can't fix a problem if you can't identify it. And if you could identify issues like like what causes unstable majorities, and you can try to figure out the money, the identifying money in politics and noticing when money is being spent in this enormously impersonal and not populist kind of way that leads to I think that awareness helps. I think that a big part of the momentum that Trump had in 2023 with his campaign, 2016 was I think there's just a lot of excitement from people behind him. I think that's just what it was, and I think people need something to be excited about, and they just don't have it right now. So there's a void waiting to be filled. I hope someone steps in. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you
evening. It
for
was so
having me.
nice getting to talk to you, and I hope that you enjoy your years of doing nothing very much. And you after 50 years of running around all over the place and writing like crazy, you could sit back and enjoy yourself a little bit.
I will.
Take care. Have a good one. Bye bye.